Greetings everybody, welcome back to Coder Journey, episode number 4 of this course about implementing the clean architecture. So in this episode, I have decided to talk about another very important, topic, two other layers, infrastructure as well as the presentation layer. So in clean architecture, these two layers, the infrastructure layer and the presentation layer, they are considered to be like the outer layers of your system. These layers handle interactions with the outside world, with, for example, a database. If you want to integrate with a database, if you want to integrate with a web backend, with a web API, these are like the bridges. Your interactions with the outside world are going to be carried out using these two layers, which we are going to talk about in this video. So as you might have noticed over the past few episodes, we have talked about the innermost layers, like the domain layer, right? And then the application layer, and we are moving outwards. So little by little, step by step, we are moving to the outermost layers. And in this episode, we are going to talk about the infrastructure as well as the presentation layer. So let's get to this. Infrastructure layer. This layer is responsible for implementing the technical details. So if, for example, as I told you, if you want to integrate with external resources like databases, messaging systems, email providers, storage services, identity providers, you're going to put the implementation here. We are going to talk about some key components that are typically found inside of this layer. External systems. These are third-party services or API that your system needs to communicate with. For example, if your system needs to communicate with a payment gateway, this is the way to do this. So as you can see, the payment gateway is using an interface. This interface is in the inner layers, like your domain layer, for example, and then the implementation of this interface is done inside the infrastructure layer. So your domain model, the code inside of your domain model depends on abstractions, on interfaces. And the implementation of those interfaces reside in outer layers. So payment gateway, as you can see here, you are free to communicate with, for example, some backend API, as you can see here, simulated API call, and then you can return something. Another example could be databases, like ORMs, for example. As you can see here, I've got a repository. This repository is using this interface. My domain model, my, for example, application services depend on this interface, not on the actual implementation. The actual implementation of this interface will reside inside the infrastructure layer, or for example, in this case, database layer, probably, because it is integrated with the database. And as you can see, it has a dependency on our AppDB context, and it is communicating with the database in order, for example, to save some, employee to the database. Again, I want to reiterate, your domain model, your application services are going to have dependencies on interfaces, on abstractions, not on concrete implementations. The concrete implementations of those dependencies on which you depend are going to be inside the infrastructure layer. Messaging, integrating with RabbitMQ, for example. By the way, I have another course coming up about RabbitMQ. I highly recommend that course to you. So yeah, for example, here, as you can see, we are declaring this class, which is implementing iMessageBus, and then we have a publish async method, and we are communicating with our message bus here. Email providers, if you want to communicate with a system which is responsible for sending out an email, this is the way to do this. Again, all of these codes that deal with integrating with like an external service are going to reside inside of the outermost layers, the infrastructure layer. Storage services, if for example you want to integrate with like a database, file system if you want to save something. Again, this is the dependency that your application services depend on. This is the implementation of that dependency residing in the outermost layers, right? And in this case, you are saving a file to disk, for example. Identity. If you want to implement authentication, authorization, this is the way to do this. Again, as you can see, this is the dependency that our application services depend on, and this dependency has been implemented here, right? And then we are doing something. I think if you take a look at the other course that I have about solid principles, especially the videos about dependency inversion, you will see what is happening here. So both the application service as well as this implementation depend on this interface. The interface is used in the application services as a dependency, and then here inside of the infrastructure layer, that dependency is used in order to implement this concrete class. So there is this concept that goes both high-level modules and low-level modules need to depend on abstractions. This is coming from the solid principles, as I told you. So this is dependency inversion at work. Now let's talk a little about the presentation layer. So the presentation layer is the entry point into your system. In modern applications, it could be a REST API that a front-end application can communicate with. It could also be a CLI, GraphQL, endpoint, UI, whatever. So this layer is responsible for receiving requests from the user or other applications, then forwards them to the application layer, to those use cases that we talked about using, for example, CQRS, and then the application layer is going to be responsible for conducting something, some task, doing something, and then returning some result. An example would be a REST API. So as you can see here, I've got this controller as my entry point, as my presentation layer. I have a dependency on the mediator library, and here I am sending a command which I am receiving in the body of this post request, right? So this is one example of having like a presentation layer as the entry point of your application. So in the infrastructure layer, we are mostly dealing with real-world implementations of the tasks that we need to be able to achieve, like data persistence, integrating with external services, and so on. While in the presentation layer, we are dealing with our user-facing interface, like the controllers. So it is like a layer that allows the consumers of the application to be able to communicate with the application. As you can see, the domain layer is protected inside of these different layers that sit around the domain model. We've got applications layer, we've got like presentation, infrastructure. So the domain model is in the center and it is protected. And the changes that happen in the infrastructure, for example, do not propagate to the domain model, which is sitting at the center. And this is the beauty of clean architecture. Again, as before, we're going to implement every single one of these concepts using the application that I have prepared. No worries, you're going to learn every single one of these topics one at a time inside of the real project that I have created. Thank you so much for watching this episode till the very end. If you liked it, please give it a thumbs up, give it a like, and I'll see you in the next episode.